bond value times 0.01%. So if the bond yield or the yield to maturity goes up by exactly 1 basis points, what is the dollar amount that you should expect, dollar amount of change you should expect in the bond value? But the financial duration itself is what is the percentage change, at least estimate of percentage change if the bond yields increase by a small amount. Your book also talks about something called yield equivalent of a 30-second. Well, in the old days, uh, still too, the quotes of the bond values are typically in the increments of 130 seconds. So if the bond value goes up by 130 second, what is the implied yield change? That's what that number is. Here's what this means. If this bond has a financial duration of 14.33, that means if the bond yields run up by 1 basis point, the percentage change in the value of this bond is going to be 0.1433%. Okay. But if this was a 5-year bond or 10-year bond, that number is much smaller. So the interest rate risk of a 10-year bond is about slightly more than half of a 30-year bond. That means the more risk, the longer the maturity of your bond portfolio, the higher is the interest rate risk. Do you guys remember what happened to Silicon Valley Bank about a year ago or so, or a year and a half ago? Silicon Valley Bank was one of the biggest investors or one of the biggest funders of venture capital firms, startups, and so on. And these guys, I was part of a consulting project that estimated a risk model for them that they had to use for regulatory purposes. And my job was to calculate interest rate risk and other risks. We actually told them that they should hedge their bond portfolio risk because they had almost $200 billion in assets. By the way, in 2010, this company had only $5 billion in assets. So they grew a lot. They made a lot of money. The trouble was 90% of their deposits was from the clients they lent money to. And those guys kept their deposits in Silicon Valley Bank as well, which means those amounts were not FDIC insured. So if the company got in trouble and those deposits were not insured, as you know, banks have to keep reserves as part of their deposits. And you have to keep them in relatively liquid assets. So they end up buying a lot of long-term assets, long-term treasury bonds. By itself, if I'm not a bank, it shouldn't be that much of a problem because let's say I'm a pension fund. For a pension fund, if I'm carrying a 30-year bond, more often than not, my obligations are also long-term because people who are paying premiums right now are going to retire over a long period of time. So my obligations and my assets have, in a sense, balanced maturity. As a pension fund, I wouldn't carry, uh, I wouldn't worry about it. But banks are in the business of making money with other people's money. A healthy bank, a very healthy bank, is a bank that has more than 10% capital ratio, which means the value of their assets or value of their invested capital divided by value of their assets is 10% or more, which means for each $100 value of asset, you have only $10 worth of capital. Okay, that's considered a very healthy bank. But if you go below 4, you're considered a firm that should be taken over. That's a very unhealthy bank. When you have a bond portfolio like that, you need to fund that, right? Well, how are you going to fund that? Well, you typically fund that in the overnight repo markets, which means every day, and these guys had over $100 billion in treasury bonds. You take those treasury bonds either through Fed funds window or discount window or somewhat. You tell people, can I please borrow $100 billion from you tonight? And they say, you're not my child, so I need some collateral. And you give your bonds as collateral. The trouble is the amount that you can borrow is the current value of those bonds. When the bond yields run up, uh, the value of those bonds went down, which means the amount that you can fund yourself went down. You have to come up with some additional money. So they try to get some additional so-called subordinated capital, which doesn't, uh, which is considered as if it's capital for bank health purposes, and they couldn't get the funding. And when their clients realized that these guys could be in trouble, there was a rush to get their money out because it's not federally insured. And Fed had to come in and they took them in. And in order to prevent a chain effect, uh, they said, okay, any deposits, we're going to back them up. But the bank and the shareholders of the bank are wiped out. Why? Because they did not manage that risk. So depending upon nature of your portfolio, you have to worry about those interest rate risks. If they kept these bonds only in 1-year bonds, the rates went up by about 0.5% during that time. Okay. So using financial duration, a 1% bond, a 0.5% change is going to create roughly less than 0.4% decline in bond value. If you have $100 billion in assets, 0.4% is only 400 million. So your capital was 20 billion, assuming a 10% capital ratio. You went from 20 to 19.6. Nobody's going to be worried about it. But if you keep them in 30 years, a 0.5% change increase in the yields is going to cost you 7%, which means those $100 billion in portfolio, you're going to lose $7 billion in terms of value. It's not a realized loss, but in the repo market, you have access to $7 billion less because nobody's going to lend you 100 billion. Because if you don't pay that repo tomorrow, I'm going to have to sell it in the market. It's worth only 93. So I'm going to lend you at most 93 anyway. Well, you had 20 billion and suddenly your capital is down to 13. That's 6.5. And at 6.5, Fed is going to be concerned. And the increase was actually more than 0.5%, so they took them in. Why? They have not managed the interest rate risk. There are a lot of different ways you can manage the interest rate risk, and one of them is matching the duration.